Our next speaker is Professor Karol Soltan from the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. Professor Soltan has served as adjunct professor of law at the University of Maryland School of Law. In addition, he has taught in the Department of Economics at the University of Warsaw, the National School of Public Administration in Warsaw, and he spent a semester as a visiting scholar at the School of Law in the University of Tulane. So, Toulouse. So please welcome him. I'm really glad that he's with us today. Have you changed the title of your talk? I'll let him introduce the title of his talk. Please welcome Dr. Soltan.
So I have a couple of preliminaries. The first is to apologize. I have not changed the title of my talk, and I will actually try to say things that are in line with the abstract that's in the program. Second preliminary, I think we're witnessing a miracle, and that is I have still things to say that others have not already said. And that may be because, well, if I recall correctly, the word human dignity, or the words human dignity, has already come up. It will come up more, but still. And that's because, maybe that's because, how should I explain it? Human beings have, for the most part, 10 fingers. And you're now wondering, how the hell am I going to make that relevant to discussion? And that means that anniversaries divisible by 10 are celebrated more thoroughly, more deeply than anniversaries divisible by 7 or 13. And this year is the 70th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so we celebrated more than we celebrated the 69th anniversary. And so I'm very much a fan of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so I thought in order to celebrate this special birthday, I would be willing to go out on multiple limbs. And so think of my talk as going out on multiple limbs, and that also makes it less likely that others will have said what I wanted to say, because if you go out on a limb, it's usually a unique limb just for you. Okay. So the way I would like to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is by searching, as my title suggests, looking for deeper meaning in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, searching for deeper meaning of the Declaration in two directions. First, try to suggest an answer to a question: what conception of justice does the Universal Declaration point to? If it's taken as a window, what do we see through this window? So that's number one. Number two, what is the larger project within which Universal Declaration of Human Rights and this conception of justice are embedded? What is the best but also most encompassing formulation of this larger project within which Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its conception of justice are components. So first, the conception of justice. What we have in the Universal Declaration, here I am repeating what others have said, is a list of rights. The philosopher Maritain at the time famously commented, "We can agree on the list, but we cannot agree on the justification for the list." So that would be deeply problematic. But it is a partial truth. If the source of justification is some philosophical school, then yes, the Kantian, the Thomist, the Confucian, and others could not agree on the justification. But there was agreement, And the agreement has continued not just on the list, but also on the source of human rights, and that is the fundamental idea of human dignity as a source of rights, of that list of rights, and then over time an evolving, expanding list of rights. So the fundamental source is taken to be the inviolability of human dignity. Still, what we have is a list of rights negotiated by states, 70 years ago. So, what's the big deal for us? Some states negotiated some declaration, and then combined with a vague idea, because human dignity is, in fact, a vague idea, as Sam quite rightly pointed out. So this is perhaps not the most promising combination as a window onto a conception of justice. But, there has to be a but. First, about the idea of inviolability of human dignity. It is a remarkably inspiring idea. So I have a little test of that. I teach comparative constitutional law, and as part of that, I teach about the German Constitution, which was adopted almost simultaneously with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1 of the German Constitution states, human dignity shall be inviolable. Damn it. Every time I say it, I have tears coming to my eyes, and I just did. Okay, so it is inspiring. And of course, it's especially inspiring if you know it's the German Constitution, 1949, facing still the memory of Hitler, facing Stalin in the East, so really on the front lines of the struggle against horrors of the crisis of modernity in the 20th century. So it is remarkably inspiring, and it is remarkably inspiring across deep divides. So it can be articulated in a secular, rationalist, Kantian way. It can be articulated in a variety of religious ways, a Buddhist way, a Christian way, a Muslim way, and so on. It is inspiring across religious and civilizational boundaries. To bring back Germany again, the formulation of Article 1 of the German Constitution is the way it is because that could be agreed upon by the three main parties of the newly emerging democratic Germany, and that was the socialists, the liberals, meaning here classical liberals, and the Christian Democrats. So it was a formulation acceptable to, in Germany, especially Kantian liberals, to Christian Democrats, combining Catholic and Protestant, and to socialists. So again, inspiring across deep political divides. So there's something about this formulation. There's something about inviolability of human dignity that has, again, a capacity to inspire. That seems to me, I can't think of a better formula. So that's number one. It's attention grabbing, and I don't want to start losing my notes all over the place. Second, I said it was a product of negotiation among states. That was kind of a way of putting in question its continuing legitimacy as a source of insight about conceptions of justice. But that's not a fair description. What actually happened was more nearly an articulation of a political culture that was emerging across various parts of the world. So the procedure was not that they would sit down and negotiate. The procedure was the committee that was doing this first asked a civil servant working for the UN to just bring together all the human rights relevant documents from around the world, constitutions, declarations, and so on, put it all together as a kind of material state of play of human rights culture as it then was. And that was the starting point of the work. And the work was really one of codification of that material. It was a process, I overuse the term articulation, but it was a process of articulation of the political culture that was emerging in response, in part to the horrors of World War II, emerging global project, articulation, a codification, but obviously not that much of a codification. You still have a long list, difficult really to organize, the underlying idea, inviolability of human dignity, quite vague. So let me suggest that perhaps the most productive thing we can do is to continue this process of codification, aiming to arrive at something that that really would look like a code of justice. One way we would know that it looks like a code of justice is that we could compare it productively with, some standard codes of justice proposed by philosophers in the recent decades. So, someone had to be the first to invoke the name of John Rawls, a code of justice of Rawls. That's one candidate. Can we formulate a code of justice as an articulation of the public political culture of the human rights project that is competitive? That's what I take to be a good goal if we're going to move away from these sort of questionable beginnings, list vague term, and try to find a conception of justice implicit in that practice. Use the Universal Declaration as a window. In the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, let me suggest some things such a code should do. Number one, it should maintain the inspiring quality of the idea of inviolability of human dignity. So that's an aspiration. A better formulation of the code of justice is one that maintains the inspiring quality of the idea of inviolability of human dignity. So not just the idea, not just maintains the idea, but doesn't lose the inspiring quality. It should aim to achieve action guiding capacity. So this was clearly an important concern in Sam's presentation. I'm sorry, I know Sam relatively well, so I can't make myself refer to him in some more professorial way. But that's a serious concern if you're going to develop a normative theory, that it be action guiding, that has the capacity to guide action. And it has, of course, traditionally been a central concern for courts and lawyers. It is courts and lawyers that routinely are given vague principles and told to act on their basis. And of course, since I'm invoking Germany, and Article 1 of the German Constitution I just gave, so now we have decades upon decades of the German Constitutional Court trying to turn that vague phrase, inviolability of human dignity, into action guiding principles and rules and so on. So this is an important, if you can't do that, it is unlikely that your conception of justice is going to be much help in making the world more just. And if the conception of justice is going to have any chance of achieving political influence, it has to be part of a larger project. It cannot be a solo thing, sort of elaborated, independent of everything else. It has to be part of an ongoing, promising project that includes supportive institutional components, includes supportive framework of ideas. And of course, the Human Rights Project is just that. So we can say that if we develop a conception of justice that is elaborating the list and faithful to the idea of inviolability of human dignity, then we're doing something with plausible claim to be part of that promising project. So the first part of my paper is basically take those guidelines and propose a code of justice. I do that, and I won't go through the entire machinery of how I do it, but the starting point is some writings by international lawyers. International lawyers, lawyers in general, have had this task of translating human rights and human dignity into practice. So they turn out to be a good source, but not a perfect source. Again, I don't want to get into the detail, but it provides, starting with their work, provides us with a way of taking both the list of rights and the idea of human dignity seriously. So again, without going into the details of construction and defense, let me give you sort of as a hypothesis a code of justice. 6 principles. I'll give you the principle. I won't keep pointing to its connection to the idea of inviolability of human dignity. For the most part, it will be self-evident. But I will add a little comment about how that principle maps onto some rights. Because again, the idea is that one should not lose the connection to the list just as much as one should not lose the connection to the underlying idea of inviolability of human dignity. So, and again, part of the elaboration is to discuss the nature of limitations on those principles, the nature of weighing of those principles relative to each other. That's not something I want to get into, so I'll give you 6 principles, and the order should not be taken as definitive of anything, at least not for today. Principle number 1, the dignity of the human body is inviolable. Think of prohibition of torture, a truly absolute prohibition in international law. Principle number 2, and I just meant that as an example, I need to move on. Principle number 2, the sources of meaning and purpose in human lives are inviolable. Indigenous cultures were extensively discussed. The destruction of indigenous cultures is a destruction of source of meaning and purpose for those people, but religion is another example, and of course there are elaborate protections of religious freedom in the Human Rights Project. Principle number 3, the procedural requirements of human dignity are inviolable, or all persons have right to equal respect. Notice that I allow 2 very different formulations of the same principle, and again, I don't want to explain why, but that's a long story. So that's civil political rights right there, in a nutshell. Principle number 4, the material requirements of dignified life are inviolable, or all persons have a right to a life free of poverty. So think of the social and economic rights there. Principle number 5, all persons have a right to the knowledge and skills required for a life of human dignity, right to education. Principle number 6, unequal treatment that violates human dignity is prohibited. So think of that human right that is in just about every document of human rights, even though it normally does not take the form of human right, mainly equality before law. But underneath equality before law is the crucial element that is connected more clearly to this 6th principle, and that is prohibition of discrimination. And the question is, what counts as prohibited discrimination? So the answer principle 6 gives is unequal treatment that violates human dignity is prohibited. So 6 dimensions of human dignity that map onto a list of rights, a code of justice. So we bring the discussion of rights, so to speak, off from, let me address sort of the philosophical literature for a tiny bit. In the philosophical literature, for the most part, human rights are a separate topic, and justice is a separate topic. This brings them together. In the philosophical literature, it is so rare to have something that combines concern with human dignity and recognition of the, so to speak, standard list that, honestly, I don't know of any. For the most part, the English language literature ignores human dignity. When it doesn't ignore human dignity, you have someone like Martha Nussbaum. However, Martha Nussbaum ignores the list of rights. So there you have it. And that may be my ignorance. Please point me to some other conceptions that would include those three things. There would be a code of justice based on inviolability of human dignity and taking seriously the list of rights. So that is my hypothesis for the ideal of justice that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights points to. It is a hypothesis. It needs elaboration. I keep elaborating it. It needs correction and needs testing. It is a hypothesis about the ethical foundation of Universal Declaration that is not simply of human rights, understood apart from practice, from politics. It is a foundation for this effort to formulate the project of human rights, formulated at this moment in history. What moment of history? Well, there are various ways to describe it, and that takes me to the second part of my comments. It is often claimed that UDHR, the Universal Declaration is a response to Hitler. It is often claimed, but it is also challenged because there's evidence that, in fact, the project of human rights was being revived before Hitler. So it has a remarkable history, this project. Last decades of 18th century, it's all over the place. It is massively present in the Enlightenment. And then it is massively absent just a few decades later. So much of 19th century, human rights are asleep. They begin to wake up just barely, when it doesn't matter the details, but let's say through the beginning of 20th century. But so that much is true. It's not just a response to Hitler. But on the other hand, oh boy, does Hitler provide a powerful impulse. Faced with this capacity of human beings, there is a need to go deep into moral foundations, into a serious moral response. And in fact, again, Germany is the front lines. It's the front lines against Hitler and also front lines against Stalin. So a broader answer to the question, response to what? What moment of history is, I would suggest, response to a broad crisis of modernity, a broad crisis of the modern project, of which Hitler and Stalin are symptoms and components, of which World War I and World War II, especially World War II, is a symptom, of which the Great Depression is a symptom, but also a generalized skepticism and despair. Those are symptoms of crisis, and they are pretty pervasive after World War II. They're still pretty pervasive today. So I think especially today, it is helpful to think of the Universal Declaration as a response to this crisis of modernity. And it's a response that is not simply a symptom of the crisis. It's one way to respond to a crisis and join it. It is, I think it can be seen as beginnings, part of the beginnings of an emerging project we might think of as the next stage of modernity, which is a reformulation of the early stage that we associate with Enlightenment. But it's a continuation of the early stage that we associate with Enlightenment. So the code of justice that I just proposed would be, could be embedded, thought of as embedded not simply in Project of Human Rights, but in this emerging project of a new stage of modernity. And if we really take this idea seriously, then we look at the periods roughly since the war as stages in the development, adding more elements to this new way of thinking that represents possibly a new stage of modernity, and especially clear innovations in those more active years that we can associate with certain symbolic dates. 1948 is one, so that's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But around that period, you have the creation of UN, you have the beginnings of the EU project, you have the Bretton Woods institutions, genocide conventions, and so on. So lots of amazing activity then. 1968, I don't have to explain, except to point to the fact that 1968 usually is associated with very radical and somewhat crazy events like May 1968 in Paris. But if we look at again, the period, it had also a component that I would call not the radicalism of May 68 in Paris, but the transformative moderation of someone like Martin Luther King. So 1968, 1989, collapse of communism in Europe, then spreading democracy into so many countries, and finally 2008. So there were these periods of activation, but in general, over time, all kinds of innovations are introduced into the project of modernity that we inherit, say, from the Peace of Westphalia combined with the Enlightenment, to speak really kind of metaphorically. So what are these elements? Let me just give you some key examples. A system constraining sovereign territorial states. These were invoked. UN, Bretton Woods institutions, well, World Trade Organization as a kind of continuation of the Bretton Woods project. Most remarkably, the European Union. So you mentioned European Union. I want to emphasize European Union. What is the European Union? Well, the best answer I can give to you, and I'm sure you're really waiting eagerly for an answer, what is the European Union? And the best answer is, that I know, is it's an unidentified political object. So a UPO. Because it's neither this nor that. It's not an international organization, it's not a state, it is something new. But look at what it has done. It has made, just to start, war between France and Germany utterly unthinkable. And if you think about 1940s, that is an unbelievable thing to happen. But not only that, it is committed to human rights in a big way. It is committed to sustainable development in a big way. It has achieved amazing things through this being of an unidentified political object. Which, what does it mean? It means that it's unprecedented, that it's something new. It doesn't fit into the categories we inherit from the previous stage of the modern project. So that's number, what is it? Number one. Number two, oh, this is going to be longer. Do we have until 7 o'clock?
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut some things then. So we have emergence of what I call moral foundations of the global project of humanity. I'm sorry about the grandness of it, but that's what it really is. And it emerges in a variety of declarations and treaties. And today we celebrate Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but more recently, 2015, the world, so to speak, that is the UN, adopted the Agenda 2030, an agenda of action for the next 15 years, focusing on sustainable development, so sustainable development goals. But interestingly, if you read that document, there are these lists of sustainable development goals and then targets, but there are also a couple of reaffirms. So there are paragraphs, sentences that say, we reaffirm commitment to inviolability of human dignity. We reaffirm commitment to Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's, I don't need those notes, really. There is a continuing developing project with a conception of justice emerging and a conception of development emerging and being modified. And sustainable development is part of this modification. Institutional innovations within states. It is really after World War II that it became standard around the world, not that every country followed it, but it became really standard to have strong constitutional courts enforcing constitutions. Before that, it was quirky Americans doing their thing. But now it's really quite widespread, so if you're advising constitution makers, you have to say, well, if you don't want to have that, you need explanation. So that's one really interesting innovation in the idea of democracy. Another, I'll put it this way, thanks. I'll put it this way. Well, there's a long story of the welfare state, the crisis of the welfare state, and so on. That's too long a story for me to cover, but that's innovation. It's a whole series of innovation. Something that is not maybe so well known is new forms, I'll put it this way, of de facto separation of powers. The constitutional systems of democracy around the world stick with the Montesquieu dogma of three branches of government, the three, but the reality of government actually doesn't fit that very well. So one just example that is kind of obvious is central banks. Where the hell do you put central banks? Well, if you want independent central banks, that should be kind of a separate branch, but who's going to talk about central banks as a branch? Apart from the fact that if you say it very fast, you start getting confused. Let me just add one other thing. I like Germany. I should say I'm Polish, so when I say I like Germany, I have credibility. A German idea developed after World War II of militant democracy. A democracy, and the strong constitutional courts are part of that, but there are other parts, features of a democratic system that is now more capable because of those features to put up a fight when challenged. Militant democracy, it seems to me we should all think much more about militant democracy these days. Fourth, institutional innovations in politics from below. Social movements, including organized social movements, a variety of initiatives that usually we call civil society, which is a lame way to call it. They're civic initiatives. We should call them civic society. Local, national, global. Nonviolent social movements. The inspiration of Mohandas Gandhi innovation, arguably in response to the crisis and moving forward to a different kind of modernity. He was a critic of modernity as we inherited it. Martin Luther King. Okay, I explained I'm Polish. The Solidarity movement in Poland, 1980, 1981, emerging bottom-up in opposition to communism, nonviolent, principled opposition. In the name of human rights. There's a connection to the Human Rights Project. These are all institutional changes that, among other things, support human rights. A final example, a new format for dramatic social and political transformation. The old format, old, outdated format, French Revolution, right? We kill them all. Well, I'm really being unfair to Robespierre. We kill them selectively, but violence is part of revolution. So French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, those were the fundamental forms, the format of dramatic social and political transformation, no longer, because now we have what we call, well, what do we call it? There's no good name, just like there's no good name for European Union. We call them sometimes anti-revolutionary revolutions, which is really awkward name. We call them color revolution, we call them velvet revolution. Non-violent but deep social and political transformations. And these non-violent movements that I just mentioned, inspired by Gandhi and Martin Luther King, certainly Solidarity was one of them, lots of others. Again, I don't have, it turns out I don't have until 7 o'clock. So. All right, so this is the new. And let me stop here. and suggest, again, these can be taken as elements of a new stage of modernity, because they contain new elements. They don't reject outright a lot of the past, but they reject some, reformulate some. And as an example, the 18th century version of fundamental principles of justice would be all about equality and freedom. Those are the twin concepts. The concept that is the central concept in this conception of justice that emerges through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, inviolability of human dignity. Well, it's not the same. It adds, but on the other hand, it's continuous, right? So there are ways of formulating it that, in fact, combine the two. So this new project that has been emerging, not yet fully articulate, that the Universal Declaration is part of, is now under serious challenge in the last, let's say, 10 years. Before it was even adequately formulated, it is now under serious challenge. So there is a new politics in the name of sovereign territorial states again to combat these larger international institutions, to combat the European Union, so Brexit, America first. Skepticism about the possibility of global ideals and goals. Skepticism about the post-World War II innovations in the practice of democracy, about constitutional courts and their power, about the various aspects of militant democracy, in favor of older forms of democracy, first of all, which were much easier to turn into facades. That's why Germany abandoned them, because Hitler showed how easy it is to turn it into a facade. There is a turn against these new forms, more militant forms, more protected against anti-democratic forces, in favor of the old forms, and sometimes just against democracy altogether. There's a move against color revolution. So, there is an alliance learning from experience, combining lessons of people like Putin and a variety of other dictators. How can we counter color revolutions? And it's been rather effective. So we have a battle between this project I was describing with UDHR, Universal Declaration, that's its, in some sense, its moral heart, or at least pointing to it, and this counter. Much can be said of what we can do in this battle, and there are many tasks, but there are also intellectual tasks. We're still missing a unifying and inspiring perspective on this project of a new stage of modernity, and also on its moral foundation. We don't have it in part because few people are making an effort to construct it. As I look around intellectual life, there are a lot of people attempting to preserve and protect what I would, in this context, call the first stage of modernity. So when Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history, it was this project he was talking about. There are others who are more speaking in the name of the crisis of modernity, often using the term postmodernity, expressing ever more radical forms of skepticism and self-doubt. But the one thing we know is that if this new stage of modernity is going to become a project, it's going to gain in strength, then it needs to be reinforced by hope, and it needs to reinforce hope. It matters that we formulate more fully this new stage in a way that is hope reinforcing. And our best candidate, I would suggest, for its moral core, at least for part of it, I should emphasize, for part of it, is this idea developing that I claim is visible through Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let me turn to my beginning and to the main subject of conference. To articulate a code of justice based on the elaboration of the core idea of inviolability of human dignity, make it less vague by identifying its dimension, make the idea of human dignity less vague, to show that the list of human rights is not arbitrary, but a product of articulation of a political culture on the emerging project of the next stage of modernity. And the list is not some arbitrary list. It points to an ideal of justice for this project, for this next stage of project of modernity. That seems to me a core task on part of the articulation of this hoped for next stage of modernity.
Working? Oh, sorry. Look, I agree with you. The reference to human dignity is inspiring. That can be a problem because if one can't make quite sense of what it means, we have as something fundamental in our politics, something most of us don't understand or wouldn't even have don't even know how to begin to try to understand it, even though we might at the same time be very inspired by it.
Can I answer that, or do you want to?
Well, I just want to make that a bit more specific. It seems to me one of the points of my talk was to say people equally find inspiring reference to common humanity and a person's humanity and recognizing a person's humanity. But one of the interesting conceptual features of saying you can't do that, he's a human being. Right? You can't treat him as though you could shoot him in the street. You have to give him a fair trial. Is that's not so, the because there doesn't function straightforwardly as an explanation. This is a way of saying, this is now our concept of a human being, that you can't do that. And it seems to me that it may be a bit like that with the concept of inalienable dignity. And I'm just wondering whether that's true, or whether you think that when you say you can't do that because he's a human being, and all human beings, perhaps not only human beings, but certainly all human beings possess inalienable dignity, whether you think that because is doing real explanatory work.
So I would like to shift the way we respond to the question, which is a fundamental question. And when I ask students to ask it, I also sometimes call it the Socratic question. What the hell does it mean? So what the hell does human dignity mean? And the one motivation for constructing this code is that is an alternative way of constructing an answer to that question. It is to identify dimensions of human dignity. So what does it mean? Well, there are 6 dimensions of human dignity, and I can identify those dimensions in a way that can also make it easier to decide cases in law under the provisions, but generally to be action guiding. So you know, fundamental to my answer to you and to that question in general is let us shift the form of the answer. That one way to clarify what human dignity means is to identify its dimensions in a way that both attempts to preserve the inspiring quality and adds to the action guiding quality. I admit it's a different kind of answer to the question.
May I just say that will work? I mean, I think that's an interesting point that you make there. But that will work only if, for example, let's take your 6 principles. If That will work if, to take the case of your 6 principles, when we think about each principles, we think, yes, the concept of human dignity really is doing some work here, or somehow seems to illuminate things for us, in the case of torture, for example. I mean, when torture was being proposed after September 11th everywhere, a lot of people did fall back on the idea of human dignity because they wanted to somehow characterize a violation. But of course, one might go the other way around and say, yes, what's terrible here is a violation of that person, and adding the dignity as nothing, right? And so on, one might go through the list. And I'm not here now wanting to say it'll work, but I'm just saying this might be a conceptual obstacle to the thought that this list will do the clarificatory work that you wanted to. That would be a question.
So,
Of the discussion, but...
yeah, the question is, you asked the question, does the idea of human dignity add anything to justification of prohibition of torture? Something like that.
I want to say, can't you see what a terrible violation this is of a human being? And then somebody says, and you know why it's a violation? Because it's a violation of their dignity. And I'm saying maybe that because doesn't work.
But
the violation is already enough.
But you see, okay, so it's interesting. We kind of reverse the order. For me, these particular provisions are a clarification of what human dignity means. Now, I hate to call it the starting point, but in a sense, the starting point here is really the empirical observation that the language of human dignity is inspiring. So it is not optional. If you care about making the world better, you care about formulating your goals and ideals in an inspiring way. It is not optional. But you need to do it in a way beyond simply saying human dignity is inviolable. That's so. The critique that I could do it all without human dignity seems to me kind of to really maybe miss the point, and maybe the key difference between me and so many other people is that let me just back up a little bit. For me, the core goal of an account, a theory of justice, a code of justice, is to help make the world more just, and that means inspiring people. Okay, so it doesn't just mean formulating in a rational way some principle. It means formulating in a way that's capable of inspiring people, because then you have a better chance of making the world better. Again, also part of a global project, institutional backing, relevant kind of power considerations, all that.
I would just make this. I agree. It might not matter, I say what you add by adding inalienable dignity to a violation. It might be just a trivial semantic point, but the paper I would have given would be to argue that though this is indeed a very inspiring idea, one of the noblest ideas, in history, it also creates terrible trouble and terrible illusion. And then I'd say this is not something, in that formulation of something really important, we have to be careful. But that I can't explain that now, but I agree it's inspiring, but it can be dangerous too.
We need to talk more.
I'm wondering what your definition of justice is, and it relates to the point that he's making. If justice is understood as coming from a place of the bare self, the sacred...
I'm sorry, that what?
If justice is understood in terms of the bare self, and it understood in terms of needs and rightful development, and connected through that to a providential order of development and progress, then that definition of justice, I think, addresses some of what he was saying. How do you define justice?
So I thought I had an answer when you started, but then I realized I will go back to that answer. But first, I need to just repeat myself. What is the concept of justice I have? Part of the concept of justice that is relevant here, it's the 6 principles, and they are based on human dignity, not on need, not on providence, on the fundamental idea of inviolability of human dignity, as understood as part of that project, so expressed in the human rights, trying to articulate those 2 dimensions. Now, what I thought you might be getting at initially is a request for some kind of conceptual map, so to speak. Where does justice fit on the conceptual map? And I can't answer that question, but I don't think you're asking it, so maybe I'll wait until someone else asks it.
The difference between a concept of justice that is aligned with principles and one that's based in the ontology of the bare self, the bare human condition. Elizabeth Cady Stanton addresses this in her last speech before Congress, Solitude of the Self. I recommend that as a maybe list of thought. So there was one question left over here, one more. We'll take the last question because then we'll have our
So, Karol, this may be a friendly amendment, I'm not sure, but as I...
Beware of friendly amendments.
But a wolf in sheep's clothing, perhaps. But as I understood the project of dignity as you described it, dignity wasn't offered as a reductionist first principle whence we can derive all the specifications of the content of a project of international human rights, but rather a procedural constraint on the project of elaborating the human rights as content. And so the mistake that's being made, at least in the first question, was to push you for justifying dignity as a first principle from whence we can derive content, when actually what you're offering is a first principle that ought guide procedure. And so to go to the second question, it's a question of procedural justice versus substantive justice.
So I hate to say this, but I can't be defended in the way you suggest. The procedural justice aspect, it's a complicated topic, but to the extent it fits in somewhere, and again, it would require a much longer answer, is in this principle of equal respect. And the others are not, so not procedural. I would say, even though I lose a vote, I would say that there are these that what I find, and I use a kind of vaguely Rawlsian way to talk about it, and if you don't care about the Rawlsian part, forget it. But what I find in the global public political culture here is a commitment to the inviolability of human dignity and the list of rights, and I try to articulate both of them, keeping the inspiring quality of human dignity, adding more action guiding, but there are, so to speak, 2 starting points, two kinds of components of the global public political culture that I take as starting points for this development, for this process of articulation. So they aren't exactly foundational, but that comes close. So I'm sorry I've just lost you, but I know, I appreciate your attempt, and it's entirely my fault that I'm sinking.
I'm sorry, one last one, and then we'll break up to do the next.
Thank you so much. I'm just trying to understand if human dignity or dignity is separate from human. I mean, if dignity shouldn't dignity be part of why we are human? I mean, why do we look at it as as something that is achieved or is obtained or is recognized? Human beings, merely for being human, represent a dignity that, whether they're 1 day old or even a fetus, or without or with all the accomplishments in the world, or there should still be treated with dignity. And I don't know why, I don't know, I'm trying to understand. I'm sorry I'm not as academic as many of you here, but perhaps this is the simplest way I can actually make my point, that if it's inherited, then why are we not looking at it that way? Sorry.
I'm not sure how to answer that, except to be repetitive. The goal for my efforts here are to articulate a conception of justice that's in the metaphor I was using, that can be seen through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also through lots of other documents and so on. And there's no question that the idea of inviolability of human dignity, that language, is crucial, central there. And I would say also that just presenting such a code is, I think it is a way of explaining, a way of elaborating, not explaining, elaborating, clarifying what human dignity might mean. One way to answer the what the hell does that mean question, but there are all kinds of aspects of it that remain kind of obscure. And I think maybe part of what you're saying is those aspects that remain obscure.
I'd like to thank Dr. Soltan for his